Hi, everybody. Today we're talking about covering speeches, meetings, presentations as a journalist. On your job for a news organization, you're frequently asked to cover this or that news conference, to cover a presentation or a speech. I remember when I was working for Radio News, my job included a once in a few weeks luncheon where guests from different countries gave presentations on politics and culture in their area. And there was food, of course, but there was also a lot of discussion, and my job was to record that presentation. So when you're doing the story on this, if you're writing a journalistic report, please be sure to include the name of the speaker, the topic of the speech, the setting of the event, and lots of quotes. Whether you're recording with an audio or video device, or if you're taking written notes, you will definitely have lots of quotes. If you're covering a meeting, that story should focus on the major action that's taken as a result of the meeting. You can also include the purpose of the meeting, some background, and again, quotes. News conferences, it's always the speaker's major point, the purpose of calling a conference, unless you have something better that you grabbed during the question and answer period. So you can change the topic, change the lead into something that you developed as a result of your conversation with the speaker. So there is a checklist of speech stories. What's the main point? What's the name and identification, the position of the person, the setting and the circumstances, and anything out of the ordinary. Meetings, you need to show up on time. You need to get an agenda of the meeting. Write out questions for interviews if there are such opportunities afterwards, or if this is a news conference type meeting, you can have questions when you're called, allowed to ask those. At the meeting, you should look for something unusual and think about people who are affected. Cover any debate or argument that goes on the floor. Meeting stories include votes, decisions, adopted policies, purpose, time, and place of the meeting, items on the agenda, discussion or debate, length of session. If it goes till 3 in the morning, that's definitely something to mention, even in the headline. Quotes from witnesses and experts, and also quotes from people affected by the decision or the issue discussed, some background on the issue, unusual departures from the agenda, and agenda for the next session. I remember one time in the Senate meeting at Oneonta, a group of students walked in to demand to hear them out on a particular topic, and that was definitely outside of the agenda. News conferences have a major point, usually the name and ID of the person who gives the conference, the purpose, time and place, duration, the background information on the major topic, the central statement, and any major discussion, usually between journalists and the speaker, and the outcome and statements would be necessary to include. So if you want to practice a little bit of information gathering, there's a little bit of an exercise at the end of these slides, and you can learn how to do some research before you go and cover a story, cover a news story. Next, I would like to talk about working with numbers and covering surveys. So surveys have a relatively short history as a way of collecting information, as gathering research. The first straw polls were very simple and there were many errors, and nowadays we know that polls are not always accurate. They show something that does not always come true. President Harry Truman's smile was very wide when he looked at the polls, and um, they turned out to be wrong after all. In the 1948 elections, he was really not expecting that outcome. The errors do not stop newspapers from from publishing wrong information. As you see in here, Harry Truman is holding up a newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman, which eventually turned out to be wrong. Polls are usually checking public opinion. Um, Publishing of a poll is simply another method of reporting, a more sophisticated method and a more statistically sort of scientific method. But it's still one method of sampling the population's views. It's not absolutely truthful or accurate. So, in order to run a good poll, we formulate the question, develop the central question. It is best to structure a close ended, a yes or no question, because open-ended questions will be hard to code, and at the end you can add open-ended questions just for quotes. Testing your questions, ask someone, friend or a relative to look at your questions or ask them to take the poll. Pay attention to the clarity of language. Make sure to ask the same question in the same way every time you do it. If you're running a verbal poll, but if you're running a written poll, of course, the uniformity will be guaranteed. A sample is the group of people with whom you run the survey, whom you poll, and a sample is usually randomized or it's a scientifically collected sample, but you should know who are your respondents. Random selections from a list of phone books or from list of phone numbers in a phone book, or just a randomized algorithm of calling up people on a computer like telemarketers do. But the fairness of your choice is dictated by the scientific um, randomness of any person being having a chance to be selected. If every person in your population group, if every person in the universe that you're polling has an equal chance of being selected, then your poll is really based on a random sample. In that case, we can say it's a probability sample, and it will show what the entire population thinks on a topic, because you're sampling just um, a group that represents the rest. So when you're reporting results of surveys and you're a journalist, how to use that information? Surveys are popular. Again, many news organizations use them as a way of generating information. They're also used for community issues rather than just elections. And we did have a class assignment. It seems like timed perfectly well to echo with what happens in society usually. So news organizations like CNN run their own polls. So what do you do when you get your polls back, when you get your results back? Analyze your data carefully before starting to write. Ask yourself, what would the findings mean, and what would be the best part of the findings? What is the most interesting result? Then you need to interpret the statistics correctly. Don't make assumptions. Be very accurate with them. Lead with the most significant finding and try to humanize the statistic. Translate it into what it means for the average person. Once you have done that, analyze the statistics and make sure that you're not misinterpreting the numbers. Organize your story with bullets first, and then you can write a narrative. Comparing subgroups means dividing up the statistics, breaking it down by gender, by age, by education level. You can use direct quotes if you have such, provide relevant details about the sample and the method, and use figures and charts to accompany your story, because those are not only provided by a lot of survey software, but also they're very good visual aids for the public, for the audience to imagine what you're talking about, because otherwise the story is dry. So in general, we said that nowadays people do polling with computers. You can do polls by phone or in person. And in this day and age, very rarely people do polling in person. And so if you don't include an open-ended question, you will not get quotes. If you were speaking with a person face to face, then anything they said would become a quote. You could write it down and with their permission, quote it literally, verbally, but if you're asking yes or no questions on a computer, it's probably not so easy to generate quotes. So we continue talking about reporting surveys. Avoid distortions. James Simon from Fairfield University has written that public opinion polls give reporters a chance to look at the views of the public towards an issue in the news. But the results of a survey depend largely on how it's conducted. And if you take media inquiry, MCOM 186, you will learn that the way you phrase the question oftentimes shapes the answer. Simon also said the reporters often pay too much attention to the sampling error that is inherent in a random survey. There are many other factors that can distort the result. So there is what we call a margin of error that is inherent in any poll. There is an allowable margin of error because not all poll results are the same as the actual truth. But a lot of times the way you conduct the poll defines the outcome. For example, James Simon had 10 factors that he suggested using in order to make sure that the poll is somewhat accurate. Reflection versus prediction. Polls are to be seen as snapshots because people's views may change. So we're reflecting on something in the moment rather than looking at the future. Sponsors. Who are the sponsors of a poll? If someone conducted a poll sponsored by a big corporation, can we trust that? Samples. How was the sample selected? Who was polled? Neutrality and accuracy. How are the questions phrased? Are you using adjectives? Are you using tinted questions that show your attitude and pushing the respondents one way or another? Contest is in what order? What is the order? What is the order in which the questions are presented? So, are the respondents giving what they feel is the right answer? Are you giving them the impression that this is a check of their knowledge? Attitudes and non-attitudes, measuring some of their attitudes by intensity on a scale. How strongly do you feel about this issue? If a person does not have much of an opinion, then asking to state a firm opinion would give you the wrong impression that the person has actually thought about this, but it could just be a random answer. And interpretations, evaluating pollsters' conclusions afterwards. Statistical significance, are the results really meaningful? Consistency, comparing the results with other polls, is this consistent with earlier polls, etc. So these are some of the methods that James Simon suggested using when you're building a poll, building a survey, to make it more or less accurate. But as we said, polls are just a snapshot. They're not really, they don't mean to give the absolute truth of the outcome because things may change and those polls are very often wrong. Thank you.